Hey guys, what's up? I am back, and sooner than expected. I know, right? I'm pretty proud of myself. Anyway, Invincible just wrapped up its second season, or rather the second half of its second season. I actually have a lot to say about it. But before we get into that, we have a word from our sponsor, NordVPN. I'm just kidding, I wish. Okay, so before we dive into the second season, I just want to do a quick little review of the first season so I can more easily compare the two seasons when I'm talking about them in relation to each other. Cool? Cool. Also, I'm going to be spoiling basically everything from season one, season two. So if you haven't seen the show or you haven't seen the second season, click right now or watch at your own risk. All right, so in case you were somehow unaware, Invincible is based on the titular comic from Robert Kirkman about a kid named Mark Grayson, the son of the most powerful superhero on the planet, Omni-Man, and how he comes to terms with what it means to be a hero. Oh, and his supposedly noble and heroic dad turns out to be a planet-conquering psychopath who has just been existing as the most powerful being on Earth to parrot for the dominion of the Viltrumite Empire. And honestly, it's really great, but mostly due to how well the show is able to take a standard superhero story and either add mature elements or play with your expectations just a little bit while still retaining somewhat silly comic book edge. And nowhere is that better exemplified with the character of Omni-Man, who is kind of the standout character of the entire show, and definitely one of the main reasons why the show was such a smash hit back in 2021 when it first dropped. He's set up so perfectly as this formidable threat and shocks you from the very first episode. He's this guy who has so easily been manipulating everyone around him for years, and the build up to the inevitable moment where the truth comes out and he changes the status quo. The show looms over the entire season, and it's done really well. Everything with Mark and his family is pretty perfect and works so well as a drama under the guise of a superhero type plot. I also like that the show kind of wants to make you think that maybe his murder of the Guardians was justified, or maybe he did it for a good reason, because you don't really know why he does it or the reasons for him doing it until the end of the season. So it kind of just keeps you guessing. In a normal superhero story, that probably would be the case, that maybe someone is mind controlling him, or maybe the Guardians of the Globe trying to be like twist villains or some stupid shit like that. But no, that act of violence wasn't justified at all. It was simply cruel, just Nolan's way of finally fulfilling the duties he had put off for so long. But putting it off for so long made him realize that he actually does care about the people he's protecting. He doesn't just view them as people to conquer and take over. He actually has feelings about them, unlike most Viltrumites. To him, they aren't just an inferior race to conquer the people he cares about. It's just great progression for his character, and J.K. Simmons voices him so perfectly, and his speech he delivers to Mark right after he beats the shit out of him is charged with so much raw emotion and power that it's honestly really haunting. It's probably still my favorite moment in the show. There are other really strong characters in the show who are bolstered by terrific voice acting. Stephen Ewan plays Mark extremely well, with this sort of naive kind of demeanor, but well-meaning. He has his world shattered by the betrayal of his dad, and watching his character come to grips with that, as well as struggle through most of his fights that he encounters, makes him likable and relatable. And yeah, I really feel for him for all the shit thrown his way. Surprisingly, I also found Debbie's stake in the story in the first season pretty good as well. Watching her investigate Nolan's, shit that he's been going through and how deeply disturbed she gets when she realizes that her husband may be just a planet-conquering lunatic. Anyway, there's also a few other solid side characters I like the Mahler twins, whose gimmick is that they constantly argue about who is the original of the two, since they're both like clones. It leads to some fun interactions, and I thought that the subplot with Rudy was pretty fun, although that's mostly due to their character rather than Rudy's. Alan the alien, who mostly serves as a comic
relief
in the first season. It's a lot of development in the second season, but he's great, and Seth Rogen does a fantastic job voicing him. Speaking of voice acting, I'm so glad that Walton Goggins of Justified fame gets to show his chops as a voice actor with Cecil, who has a pretty tense and strained relationship with Nolan. Goggins plays him really well, and he has this kind of no bullshit kind of attitude that adds a lot to the character. Although I wish you got more of his arc instead of serving as a character who kind of has a role in everyone else's plot lines. He's still really great. I just wish that they would have utilized him a little bit more, to be honest. The fights are brutal, intense, and well-directed most of the time, specifically with the fight in the 5th episode in that Machine Head guy's mansion. The mature elements add a lot of weight to most of the fights and make them feel like there's going to be real consequences and stakes to everything. However, the show ain't perfect, and there are a couple things I don't like about the first season. Some of these problems do carry over into the second season, so I thought I'd mention them still. Most of the new Guardians of the Globe are pretty uninteresting, and not for lack of trying. I don't think that they're badly written characters. They just don't have anywhere near as interesting plot lines or character arcs as like Mark or Omni-Man, or hell, even the other side characters I just praised. The plot point about Rudy getting into his new body to be with Monster Girl takes up a good chunk of screen time, and that could be used on other stuff that's more interesting, like Machine Head or Titan or Damien Darkblood. As a result, I don't feel like a lot of the other subplots really did much for me, like the Mars Sequid episode, the episode where Mark, Amber, and William visit like a college. Speaking of Amber, she probably gets the reward for the most annoying character in the entire show. It also doesn't help that we've seen this type of superhero trying to balance being a superhero with his love life, like, I don't know, 18 billion times. And the writers don't really change it up enough to make it interesting. So it kind of just feels like wasted time. Amber just drags down scenes really hard, and the romance stuff with her is focused on way more than it needs to be. Oh, and also she literally gets mad at Mark for leaving to change into his costume and save their lives. Would you prefer he help out as just normal human Mark? What's he gonna fucking do then? Her character is really inconsistent. One last thing is that the budget for the show was clearly spent a lot on the like insane voice cast and less so on, well, the animation, which is fine most of the time, but there are times where it looks about the same level as those like Rainbow Six Siege anime-inspired cinematic trailers they keep dropping in their new seasons, which they probably make in like a month. That's a small nitpick though. Anyway, these problems don't ruin the show at all, and the finale is really great. I would give the first season of Invincible probably an 8.5 out of 10. So, how is Season 2? Is it good as Season 1? Were some of the problems of the previous season fixed? Well, the answer to those two questions are no, and, well, sorta. Yes, sometimes. Now look, I don't think this is a bad season of TV at all. I found most of this new season pretty enjoyable to watch, and some of it I love. I would still say it is noticeably weaker than that electrifying first season. In my experience, the most controversial thing they've added to this season with regards to who I've been speaking about the new season with would be that the new time travel and dimension hopping stuff that is teased the moment the season begins with that alternate reality version of her where Mark signs with his dad and they take over the planet for which might rule. It was a pretty interesting season opener. I didn't expect it, and it sets up a good arc for Mark, but definitely did feel like a flashy intro to a season opener that was mostly just kind of decent. This episode may serve to introduce the new threat they'll be dealing with throughout the season, or so I thought. You see, while I do like Angstrom as the concept for a villain, and honestly, the way he becomes a villain is pretty tragic, he has no hope of being anywhere as interesting as Omni-Man was in the first season. And he is only prominent in like 2 episodes of the season, one of which he's a good guy for most of it. So he feels kind of disconnected from the main plot and disconnected from Mark, which is kind of a problem because the last episode revolves around the two of them interacting a lot. And all the stuff they do with him in the finale is pretty great. He should have made a splash somewhere in the middle of the season to like show that he was still a more integral threat to the show, kind of like Vicious and Cowboy Bebop, where he just periodically shows up to mess with the main characters. And as the first half of the season progressed, they began to introduce new subplots. All the stuff with Donald seemed kind of dumb. He actually grew to be a pretty solid character, and watching the bumbling government agent come to terms with who he really is was strangely compelling, and the rift it creates between him and Cecil is explored pretty well. I'm interested to see what they do with later seasons. Unfortunately, most of the new stuff they have in the bulk of these first 4 episodes is largely uninteresting to me, especially when it comes to basically everything to do with the Guardians of the Globe. Although they are better utilized in the second half of the season, I don't find their chemistry that great, and the Immortal becoming their leader is like a cool idea, I guess, but it's not fleshed out as much as I'd like it to be. The stuff with the underwater Atlantis Queen was passable, if not mostly filler. Episode 3 tries to be funny, and it falls completely flat. The return of Alan was pretty awesome, though, and I will say I did like seeing how the Viltrumite rule is affecting other planets around the galaxy and the planets that are being put into action to stop them. But my biggest problem with this episode was like when Alan's just like murdered, just his eyes just ripped out of his socket, and it was so obvious they weren't actually going to kill him. And then right after we see that, we get back to like Mark and Amber talking about like their relationship, and it was just like tonal whiplash. I don't know, it just didn't really, the tone was not balanced at all in this episode, if I'm being honest. But I did like what they were doing with Debbie in these first few episodes. There's a little subplot she has where she goes to this like help group for people who date superheroes, and it explored the trauma associated with dating a superhero, or at least being involved in it romantically with a superhero pretty well. And even though it was all supposed to be anonymous, Debbie and this other guy start talking outside of the group, maybe you think, oh, maybe they might get together. That's nice. This is nice, but nope. As soon as she breaks down and reveals that Omni-Man was her husband out of guilt from learning that the guy's wife was murdered by Nolan, he gets pissed off and resents her for even being with him and standing up for her in the first place. It's compelling drama, which is something the show is surprisingly pretty good at. But this all leads into episode 4, which is easily the best episode of the season up to that point, but mostly because of, surprise, surprise, they focus on the stuff that everyone likes the most, Omni-Man and Mark. And yeah, this episode is pretty great, although it still have some small issues. Firstly, and I'm gonna take this one out of the way because I didn't even bring it up in the last segment about season 1, is I don't really like when this show puts licensed music and like music that's like non-score music into the show to prove a point or time with the emotion of a scene. Don't get me wrong, I think the Nick Cave song fits here, and maybe even so does the Radiohead Karma Police drop in the beginning of the season. But I don't know, I would just rather hear score music instead of just having the showrunners just lazily throw in a song there that kind of just forces you to think, oh yeah, this is a sad moment, instead of just having either no music or composing music that's literally specific for that scene. I also don't really like Nolan's decision to have another kid with these Thraxan people. I mean, sure, I do think that having another kid and having Mark have like a half brother, I think it sets up some good stories for later on, but I don't really get why Nolan would decide that it's a good idea, because I mean, sure, they wanted him to come by to protect them and to, you know, be their leader. But the thing is, he already knows that if he has this kid, since they can't interbreed with people who aren't of their same biology, I don't get why he even thought to himself, okay, even though it's a really bad idea, I'll have this kid. I mean, he just really wanted to get with this grasshopper. I don't really know. Other than those issues, though, I think this episode gives great development for Omni-Man and Mark. The fight itself is pretty great between Mark and Omni-Man and the Viltrumites. And it's the first point of the season where the violence actually feels earned and actually adds to the dramatic weight of the situation. I like seeing Mark actually fight back for real and not hold back. And it's a good setup for what happens in the finale. And in retrospect, it was actually the perfect choice to have him not like just execute that Viltrumite soldier and hesitates not to undercut the part in the finale. Not to mention the animation and overall look of the show is probably at its strongest here with the pink skies of Thraxa creating this amazing backdrop. And damn, that cliffhanger this episode where Kree gives Mark an ultimatum, blackmailing him into doing the same thing no one's supposed to do, yeah, that definitely had me really just reeling to see what happens next in the second half. And the second half, I think, is stronger than the first half. I don't really have any new complaints except with the fact that, man, when Mark finally breaks up with Amber officially, boy, was that long overdue. I mean, I think Amber's a better character in this season, to her credit, than in the first season. But man, I'm glad the show is moving past her, at least for the time being. Although like Kate and the Shrinking Woman and Robot and Monster Girl mostly still are kind of just background characters at this point, I do think that Immortal and Rex get a lot more focus on, and the fight episode 5 where they both have a lot of really shitty things happen to them is really great. I like Rex's new transformation. I like that Immortal is starting to be disturbed by just how reckless he's becoming. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the second guy from the first half of the season, yeah, he's not new shit for me. I don't know why people like this character. I just don't really, I think he's kind of just boring as hell. And don't even get me started on the Lizard League bullshit. I guess they're supposed to be stupid, but I don't know. They just aren't interesting at all. Everything with Alan, though, is amazing. His interaction with Mark and seeing him like actually hold his own against a Viltrumite and then play dead to sneak under the ship was just so much fun. Pretty much everything with Alan this season was pretty great. And honestly, I wish they kind of used him more. I think that Nyssa proves to be a pretty important character for the Viltrumites because of the way that she shows that Viltrumites aren't just like literally pure evil, and that they do actually have a reason to help out the people of Earth. And that part where Mark is genuinely shocked that she actually helped him out is a pretty great moment too. But yeah, I won't pro off the finale any longer because that's where most of the juicy, meaty story stuff comes into play. So after basically being absent other than a few like small post-credit scenes and like a few episodes this season, Angstrom comes back and holds Debbie and Oliver hostage. Mark shows up and gets juked by Angstrom a few times. There's talking dinosaur. We get to see more of his backstory. And Mark meets Spider-Man, talks to Batman at some point, and it culminates in him beating the shit out of Angstrom to death in the Ultimate Dimension. Yeah, it's kind of a lot, but surprisingly, it does work pretty well, and the show gets back to balancing tone correctly with the moments of levity as Mark is hurled down from one dimension to another, while Debbie is getting her arm snapped off by a man with an oversized cranium wearing a business suit. I don't know, while I'm not so on this show embracing the time travel and dimension hopping stuff, and mainly just serve as a way to give the villain the correct motivation, I think it strangely works here, and the idea of Angstrom finding the one Mark who didn't take Nolan's side is poetic in an odd sort of way. The whole thing is kind of silly, but in a comic booky way while still having that dramatic weight that the show usually is really good at. Time travel and dimension hopping stuff just works for superhero shows. I mean, it's already an inherently silly concept, so why not tag it along with a already pretty silly genre of movie entertainment? And if there are plot holes, it doesn't really bother me that much because usually it's just there to make the story more fun. Think of Back to the Future. Does the time travel in that make a lot of sense? Is it perfect? No. Does it provide a pretty good backdrop for a really fun story? Yes, it does. No one's going to complain about the time travel aspect of reading a movie Back to the Future. It's Back to the Future. But anyway, I'm not going to compare Back to the Future to Invincible. They're not the same. But if you don't like the time travel dimension hopping stuff, I totally get that, and you're well within your right to dislike it. That's totally fine. I just think that personally, it's the only genre of movies and TV and books where that type of storytelling can actually work. The moment where Mark just loses his shit and beats the hell out of Angstrom was a really powerful moment in the show, and the trauma he experiences and is believable. And this conversation with Debbie solidifies his arc this season and sets him up for new stories and challenges really well. But yeah, I mean, I think that the show sets up really good stuff for season 3, and I'm really excited for it. And while it did have its share of problems and is definitely weaker than the first season, it's still a great show, and I just like seeing the way that these writers flip standard superhero tropes and just run wild with it. Hopefully the wait isn't nearly as long this time. I'm going to give Invincible season 2 a 7.5 out of 10. Oh, and by the way, I'll cover the season 4 of The Boys this summer, maybe the Fallout show if I feel like it. So yeah, adios.